So maybe the only good thing we can say about our current situation in the US is that it is incredibly clarifying. At this point, we know that our financial and corporate elites have demonstrated kind of total collapse and fealty to profit. They haven't just like bent the knee to the current regime, they've crumpled to the ground in like pathetic fealty. And I guess also, if we were ever wondering how authoritarian, populist regimes or fascist regimes get going, how they take over and ruin countries, well, now we know. Yeah, I mean, I've found myself, thinking a lot, writing a lot about politics, I guess, whatever that is recently. I never meant to be a political commentator or a political thinker. My lifelong interests were art, the avant-garde, consciousness, mysticism, the occult, and I guess also systems change, social transformation. When I was young, that was New York in the 1970s, I had a profound sense that there was something sort of like deeply broken, deeply wrong with my society. And, this was beyond any Marxist or Freudian or Frankfurt School analysis of our situation. But it wasn't until I really started to explore psychedelics seriously in my late 20s that I felt like I really began to understand what exactly was wrong. So my first book, Breaking Open the Head, I started writing in my late 20s. It was published when I was 35. And as I was researching that book, I went to visit, West Africa. I went through a Bwiti initiation in Gabon, taking iboga. I worked with an indigenous community in Ecuador with ayahuasca and visited the Mazatec Indians, indigenous people in Mexico and Oaxaca. And I had all these crazy experiences that really showed to me there were these sort of visionary and transcendent aspects of reality. And that actually indigenous shamanic practices, even modern chemicals can lead us into these other dimensions of reality. And these other realms, you can also find they unleash paranormal, psychic, and supernatural phenomena that sort of like breach the boundary between the psychic and the physical. And this, for me, challenged, and eventually it forced me to change my whole paradigm away from scientific materialism, from sort of skepticism, to kind of an acceptance of shamanism, animism, kind of a Jungian philosophy. I started as a hardcore skeptic, and for me, I had to really be convinced by many repeat experiences, all sorts of phenomena, telepathy, psychokinesis even, synchronicity. And that was combined with very careful study and reflection of people like Carl Jung and, yeah, like a whole range of literature and so on. So then I was like, okay, well, scientific materialism, where did it come from? I mean, it's just a hypothesis, right? It developed in, maybe the 17th century with Descartes and the 19th century. And materialism argues that consciousness is something that emerges from the physical, from matter, in some way that we still really don't understand. And that's called the hard problem of consciousness, okay? So after sitting with that for a long time and studying and researching, I discovered this alternative paradigm of idealism, which is sometimes called analytic or monistic idealism. And this posits that consciousness is actually the underlying reality. The physical universe is a kind of transitory projection of this field of consciousness, this innate primordial field, which needs to create, in a way, separate containers of subjective awareness, such as beings like ourselves, if it's going to know anything, if it's going to explore, create, or feel, or discover, or build anything, because otherwise it's just in this sort of like immanent, non-dual state. And yeah, there's certain psychedelics which really help you experience this directly, particularly 5-MeO, DMT, or Bufo. And now there's a number of contemporary thinkers who agree that idealism is actually the better hypothesis. And it meshes with what we've learned about the deep structure of reality from quantum physics. And idealism also, in theory, would allow for us to imagine or to begin to hypothesize around other aspects of our being, aspects that exist before we are born and continue after we die. The physicist Amit Goswami developed a provisional model for how all of this works in his book, Physics of the Soul. So if we look at things like quantum non-locality and action at a distance, we can develop this model that there could be patterns of thinking, feeling, and willing that we kind of like, that become coherent as we're alive, and they remain linked, and they seek to continue their kind of like inertia or their momentum by taking over another physical body through incarnation. There's actually quite a lot of good evidence supporting some form of reincarnation, although, of course, our understanding remains very provisional and rudimentary, and it's very hard to prove anything like that scientifically with the knowledge we have now. Doesn't mean we won't know more in the future, have different ways of understanding things. So some of this evidence is presented in the works of Ian Stevenson, who wrote Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect. He found children all around the world who had spontaneous recall of their past lives. Also, if you go deep into Tibetan Buddhism, or if you're lucky enough to speak to some lamas, it becomes evident that the Tibetan Buddhists really have a highly refined spiritual science around reincarnation. And then you have Western occult thinkers like Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner, who propose that we in the West actually lost this knowledge of reincarnation or the transmigration of souls with the rise of Judeo-Christian monotheism. Steiner claimed that it was the mission of his life on Earth to reintroduce an understanding of reincarnation to the modern Western world and the modern consciousness. And he actually explored how, from his perspective, this works in a really pretty amazing series of books called Karmic Relationships. And for Steiner, it's not only that we as individual human beings incarnate again and again in some way or other, the earth itself reincarnates. And in his cosmology, which I'm not saying is like the absolute truth, but it's a very interesting kind of vector or way of understanding or thinking about reality. We're currently in the fourth incarnation of the earth, moving into the fifth incarnation, and humanity changes as well as animals and plants. Everything changes, minerals, with each new stage of this evolutionary incarnational journey. Anyway, it's quite a fascinating perspective. I've been doing some online seminars about it, liminal.news. You can check them out. And I've got one coming up that I'm doing at the Steiner Foundation in New York. So in my past writing, I explored what seems to me an obvious relationship between this idealist paradigm, which understands consciousness as this sort of ontological primary, the basic underlying nature of reality, and a leftist utopian social ideology, which would recognize the value in all human beings and all subjective perspectives as aspects of this underlying field of consciousness, which is ultimately unitary and non-dual. And so I believe that the left has sputtered out and failed over the last centuries, actually because it lacked this idealist or non-materialist ontology. And instead, we have like communism, socialism, anarchism have been linked very much with scientific materialism and atheism. Karl Marx was a scientific materialist, Rosa Luxemburg. And the idea was, progress was towards kind of like, unflinching atheism. But the problem is it's actually very difficult, if not actually maybe ultimately impossible, to build and to sort of hold a coherent ethical framework when you have a purely materialist worldview, when you think that life, the end of our individual lives is the annihilation of any experience. This is inherently nihilistic. And this is partly why over the last decades, the American and European left lost their way and they got mired in this kind of identity politics. So the left got sort of stuck on those elements of our kind of human beingness that divide us and separate us, things like race and gender and so on, instead of kind of honing in on our intrinsic unity, since we're all subjective expressions of this underlying field of consciousness itself. So we've also seen how sort of scientific materialism leads to this focus on the technology and the technological singularity, and the hope that maybe we could create immortal bodies, which is what a lot of the tech oligarchs are now hoping to do, and why they're so focused on artificial superintelligence at all costs. So another extremely valuable aspect of idealism is that it allows us to give the different world religions their proper due and understand them better. It provides a context for understanding all these different religions properly without getting sucked into these kind of obsolete doctrines. The biblical or Quranic revelations make sense, and they can be read as authentic expressions of the completely authentic, meaningful communion with the divine or with the transcendent realm. And this impulse to commune with the divine or get messages or revelations is absolutely essential to our humanity and basic to it. But at the same time, the various religions need to also be understood as historical artifacts and cultural constructs. The revelation comes through, but the expression it has is related to the local knowledge, the sort of parochial knowledge of a particular people at a certain time and a place in history. So when we understand idealism and we see the reality of this transcendent domain, then we can acknowledge that the big mistake made by all these religions is their attempts to sort of freeze knowledge or, quote unquote, truth or absolute truth in certain scriptures that were written, really at this point a long, long time ago. Divine revelation and sacred communion, it's not going to end with any musty old book. We need to kind of re-access and re-understand that our relationship with the divine is actually an ongoing, ever-evolving process. We're actually consciously participating in this ongoing revelation, to the extent that we want to, and psychedelics for many people prove that. You have the direct visionary experience. You don't need to just read about it in the Bible or because Muhammad or Moses had this experience. The poet Rilke noted, although we may not like it, God is growing. And if God is growing, it's growing through us. It's growing through our evolution, through our development of deeper capacities for love, for care, for wisdom, and so on. So then we can ask ourselves, why did this happen? Why did these, archaic books, that obviously are very beautiful in part, but are not really so relevant to who we are now? How did they become so charged with meaning that they ended up determining the arc of human history in such a profound way from, thousands of years ago up until this moment, up until today? So I have some theories about this that I want to offer to you. So yeah, we know that the New Testament required a massive amount of editing and revision, and this involved throwing out other scriptures from that maybe were even earlier, from the first centuries after Christ lived, assuming that he did live, which I tend to think he lived. So some of these scriptures were discovered accidentally by farmers in Egypt in 1945, and they were eventually published as the Gnostic Gospels. And they show that, like the early Christianity, there was actually a lot of kind of contention over how to interpret Christ and the scriptures and so on, and there was more like a lot of variance on certain ideas, Gnosticism. But almost universally, the spiritual practice of indigenous communities involves kind of rites of initiation. Candidates for initiation when they were young often would undergo an ordeal. They would have to attain the visionary state for themselves. In alchemy, they talk about this as dying before you die. Okay, so this is, for instance, what occurred, as far as we know, at Eleusis, the mysteries of Eleusis in Greece, which went on for about 2,000 years before they were ended by the church in the 4th century AD. Every year, all the greatest figures in Greece would come, and they would probably ingest a psychedelic potion together that might have involved ergot fungus that was called the kykeon, although we don't know this for certain quite yet. But so as societies became more complex and populations grew and became more settled due to agriculture, the purpose of spirituality and ceremony seems to have undergone a big change. Religions became more hierarchical, and they became focused on indoctrinating kind of the mass people into a rigidly controlled structure of morality and hierarchy and so on, instead of helping people to undergo initiation for themselves so that they would be sort of equals, that everybody would have attained the same direct revelation or gnosis for themselves, and they would share that understanding. So religion ultimately became an essential part of the apparatus of the monarchy and the state, evolving into a social and ideological program for elites to maintain their dominance and control over everybody else, and their control over resources, over what type of sexuality could be expressed, over access to God, or even over the possibility of salvation or redemption in the afterlife. And we see this today with evangelicals, where they think like, if you allow for abortion, they based on some ancient biblical scripture, then you're not going to make it into heaven. But this is just interpretation of very old texts. So another factor that I think has kept people enthralled or fixated by these ancient scriptures, like the Bible or the Quran, is the sort of power of the written word at a time when writing and literature was scarce. And over a long period, civilization shifted from an oral to a writing-based culture. And when you have writing, a culture's legacy is no longer just contained in memory and recitation alone. It gets stored in these kind of external prosthetic devices, these books or scrolls at that point, which maintain cultural stability and coherence over a long time. I think this was like a very profound experience in the human psyche, and we're still wrapped up in that, in this history of these documents and the impact, the sort of morphogenetic field created around these documents and the belief in them. So those initial revelations which shape a society or civilization continue to hold a particular force, like an electrical charge, whether it's like Moses or Muhammad or whatever. And the scriptures are like a source code that perpetuate a culture's legacy and its traditions over time. And over many, many generations, people invest so much of their belief in these books. They're taken as articles of faith, as divine revelations, never to be questioned. And of course, these scriptures themselves are often full of admonitions and warnings that were kind of aimed at the people at that time, telling them the faithful that they never should question them, that these are the absolute truth. And that was a way of keeping everybody, kind of under the control of the priest class. So from this idealist perspective, we can see how these religions of the book ultimately led to cultures that were based on, blind faith, indoctrination, and obedience. And we don't need to scorn or reject the transcendent power or divine inspiration of the original scriptures, as scientific materialists often do. We can recognize and acknowledge that those revelations were real. There is this transcendent domain of non-dual illumination and so on, but its social expression is historically and culturally determined. From the idealist perspective, we can see that the religious worldview of a society, its ontology, also always shapes its politics, its economic conditions, as well as its relationship to its local ecology or to the planetary ecology as a whole. And we see this with scientific materialism, which I think in a way, once we understand that it's just a hypothesis or theory that developed over a historical period, it became, in a very real sense, although non-religious, it became kind of the religion of modern secular society. Scientific materialism offers a hypothesis about the nature of reality, just as Christianity or Judaism or Islam does. As those religions have their idea of what reality means and what forces govern it and what's important to maintaining it and so on. In the default faith of the secular world, scientific materialism, this also produced a range of effects on the consciousness of people in a modern society and on civilization as a whole, just as Christianity or Islam impacted people in traditional European and Middle Eastern societies. So we could say that scientific materialism finds its natural social expression in bourgeois capitalism, consumerism, and materialism, where people really only value what they can physically possess or what they quantify, let's say, as digits or numbers in their bank accounts and so on. Anything that can be tabulated or quantified becomes real to them, and other things are dismissed. And this is what René Guénon talked about as the reign of quantity, as the sign of kind of modern decadence and so on, rather than quality as quality of experience, quality of consciousness, intensity of consciousness, and so on. So I wanted to take some time to really reflect on this today, because I'm seeing a lot of people I know actually turning back toward traditional religious structures because we're in this confusing and dangerous time. They're grasping for Christianity or Judaism and so on. Personally, I think this is a mistake, and that we need to take a step forward instead. We need to step forward toward a new worldview that integrates idealism, this sort of consciousness first kind of paradigm, as a metaphysical stance, rather than going back and taking a regressive return to traditional faith, which requires this doctrinaire belief in obsolete scriptures that were definitely appropriate for their time and definitely were an outgrowth of transcendent vision and revelation, but they don't make sense for us now. We've reached a different place, and this is kind of the problem with evangelical Christianity in the U.S. and Orthodox Judaism and even Islam and so on. So from where we are now, we could actually think about constructing or shaping a new kind of like universal religion around our contemporary post-secular ethos. And if we were going to try to do this, we'd make it non-sectarian, phenomenological, investigative, creative, open-ended, tentative, playful, collaborative. So I think this would be really a great project, as long as we can, rigorously avoid, guruitis, doctrines, dogmas, any system of indoctrination or control. And I think from this perspective, we can also see the error in the modern psychedelic renaissance, which kind of started after Breaking Open the Head and my first book, and led to all this money going to psychedelic companies and something. And stuff like that. But I think that, we can see that the rediscovery of psychedelic compounds and visionary plants was a new revelation for many of us now. And in our very Western way, we have hyper-focused on these chemical catalysts and the individual experience, the individual healing journey, or the capacity to get more creativity or entrepreneurial ideas and so on. But we've ignored the larger social, political, and ideological context in which we have these experiences. Psychedelic research became a safe space in a way for wealthy progressives to invest in, as it vaguely promised some kind of eventual societal change or consciousness change without requiring any inquiry or any kind of confrontation with the exploitative structures of late-stage capitalism. Or what would be a psychedelically inspired praxis that we could develop to address this. So I had already kind of understood this years ago, and I tried to create such a praxis with this Evolver network we created, the Evolver social movement, and in my 2016 book, How Soon Is Now, I tried to look into it. And yeah, I'd love to try again, remembering Samuel Beckett's dictum, which I often think about, which is, I don't remember which novel it was from, but it was basically try, fail, try again, fail better. And at this point, yeah, we really need to come up with a different paradigm to address this kind of runaway train of our society and this kind of new Christian kind of madness where people are sort of like looking for a contemporary moral structure in these very obsolete moral codes from these ancient scriptures because they don't really know where else to turn. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you found this interesting. If you enjoyed my ideas and my work, please please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please share it and read my articles on my Substack, which is danielpinchbeck.substack.com. And yeah, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.